What's going on, kids? Today we're going to take a look at the front disc brakes on this 2001 Accord. Out in front of me I've got some basic hand tools, the stuff that we're going to use in order to do this job. And most of these are things that you probably have kicking around the garage, or if you're starting to build your tool collection, these are some of the first things that you're going to want to buy. So let's take a closer look and see what we need. So some of this stuff you definitely don't need and probably don't have at home, but here in the shop, just to make things easier, I've got a battery-powered impact for taking the wheels off. I've got a fancy electric torque wrench that I wanted to show you how to use. That's kind of nice because you can use all sorts of different units. If if it's in science units or freedom units, you can switch here just by cycling through. But for the job, really all you need is a set of basic wrenches, a C-clamp, which I'll get to in a bit. Some brake grease that I buy in these bottles, but you can get in those little pouches when you go to the parts store. They usually have them there, on the little spinny thing next to the spark plug gap tools. And just in case we need them, in case the brake rotors, decide to disagree with what we want to do with them, which is remove them, we can hit them. Before I pull the wheel off, I want to jump on Identifix and take a look at all the torque specs that I'm going to need. I usually like to print all that stuff out ahead of time, and then I've got it sitting right next to me while I'm trying to work on the car. So once you're on Identifix, we need to look this up the same way we look up any other car, and this is a 2001 Honda Accord. It's an EX with the 3-liter motor down there. And Identifix is going to give us a specific spot that has just the brake specs in this quick hits area. So my little shadow thing is off my mouse cursor, so quick hits is here, and then under specs, you need to come over here to brake specs. So we can click on that, and it's going to take us to all of the information we need specific to our brakes. And there's an exploded view, so these are incredibly handy. That kind of lets you know where all those pieces are and kind of how those parts go together. We can see we've got our caliper bracket here with shims and those rubber boots that we need to make sure are greased. We've got our pads with metal shims that go on either side, and we can see that there's actually 2 shims on the back side, these little guys here. We can see our squealer clip here, our brake pad wear indicator coming off of the side, so that should be on our inside pad. And then our caliper itself with the bleeder screw with a rubber cap, the slide bolts, and the top one here looks like it has a little piece of rubber on it. And then this is the piston, the cup seal, and our dust boot. We don't need to worry too much about those. Here's all the specs for the later things that we're going to get into, like run out and parallelism, and how much material we can remove. Here's the procedure on brake bleeding if you're trying to get all the air out of the system, with ABS and without. But this bit up here is really what we want to look at. And I'll zoom in on this so it's a little easier to read. So we need to find, 6-cylinder. On this first bit here on our front, we're going to be working on the fronts. So the torque spec from caliper to bracket. So that's this part here, the caliper, onto this bracket. And that's this bolt here with the slides and those threads. The torque spec on that is 36 pound-feet. So 36 pound-feet from the caliper to the bracket. This bolt here that mounts the caliper onto the brake bracket itself. And then back here, bracket to knuckle is 80 pound-feet. So it's a lot more to mount the bracket to the knuckle than you would use to mount the caliper to the bracket. So we got to remember those and keep those straight. 36 pound-feet for the slides and 80 pound-feet for the bracket. Let's head back out there and start pulling this thing apart. So back at the car, and while I was in there, I also looked up the wheel torque spec when I'm putting things back together. And I'll just kind of keep this on the rack next to me while I'm working, so if I ever need to look back at something. I've also got that exploded view on here in case I'm trying to put it all back together, and I'm not sure how all the pieces fit. Whenever I pull off a wheel tube, I like to set it kind of next to me where I'm working and underneath the pinch weld, so this seam right here on the car. so that if something fails with the jack that I'm using, the car will fall down onto the wheel instead of me while I'm underneath it. Speaking of safety stuff, I should probably grab some safety glasses too. So a quick inspection here, we can see that this car's obviously been sitting for a while. We've got surface rust on the whole rotor here, but I don't see any like major grooves or buildup or like a nasty groove up here at the top that would maybe cause some noise. And we can look in here on the side and we can still see a definition between the backing plates and the actual friction material, but there isn't a lot, so we're not quite on metal yet, but we're not too far off. So let's pull this thing apart and see what we can see. So looking from the back side of the wheel, these are the two bolts that we need to remove. These are the ones that mount the caliper itself onto this bracket. They're 14 millimeter, and you'll notice from the camera's perspective, I'm going counterclockwise to remove them, but from my perspective on this side, I'm actually going clockwise. So that's where I kind of always caution everybody against the righty-tighty, lefty-loosey thing. It's clockwise and counterclockwise as if you're staring at the head of the bolt. So I'm going to take this top one and spin it counterclockwise for you, but clockwise for me. Run this out with my hands because this is a car show and bolts always come out super easy. And then I'm going to go to the bottom one here and I'm going to knock this one clockwise for me, but counterclockwise as if I was looking at the head of the bolt. Get that the rest of the way out. And now this is where I need to push some of the pressure off of the rotor. So I'm going to grab the back of the caliper and pull towards me a little bit until I feel a little bit of a shimmy in here. And now this caliper should peel off. So this caliper moves a little bit. I'm going to try and peel it back here. And one of the tools that I forgot to bring up when we were going through the list is just a metal brake caliper hook. There's a ton of these hooked onto a toolbox over by the door. And we want to grab this hook and run it through anything we can so we can hang the caliper by the suspension. Because remember, we don't want to have any weight hanging on this brake hose right here. There's some cotton and some metal run through this rubber hose to make sure it doesn't stretch. But if we put all the weight of this caliper on there, it can damage that internal structure. So we're just going to take this and kind of hook it up on this upper control arm so that it's out of the way. Scratch that, we're going to go to the spring. Got it. So looking at this caliper, it's pretty rusty, but rust isn't a big deal. It's sitting outside and that's going to happen. As long as this piston here can still slide in and out of the body and this dust boot's in good shape, and when we do before we put it together, we're going to put the C-clamp on here and try and push this piston back in. And as long as it moves freely, this thing is fine, even though it's just kind of ugly. But now the caliper's out of the way, we can actually get a good look at these pads. And you can see we've got a little bit more pad on the inside than we do on the outside. And these should be replaced. They're getting down there. So let's pull these apart and get a better look. All right, so these aren't really playing nice. So let's go ahead and remove this whole caliper bracket, and then we can just slide them out that way, or we can knock them out with a hammer once it's actually off the car. So I want to move the camera back to the back side and show you these two anchor bolts that are back here that are going to lock the caliper bracket onto the steering knuckle itself. So under the back side of the car, we can see we've got our slides back here, that these move. That's a good thing. That's what our caliper bolted onto. And then we've got these two larger bolts here for the caliper bracket. And these are the ones that needed 80 pound-feet of torque. So these here are the 80 pound-foot of torque ones, and then the little bolts right there that went into here, those are the ones that were 36 or whatever it was. That's why I print things out, because I have a terrible memory. And now that that's apart, we can get a better look at these pads. And again, like I said, these are pretty nasty. They're kind of chipping apart and breaking apart. You also as we talked about in class, don't want to touch this friction material part here with your bare hands. Now, these are done and going to be replaced, so it doesn't matter if I touch them now, but they're pretty nasty. You can see they're contaminated too, and to even get them out of here, because this thing's super rusty, I'm going to have to hit these with a hammer. All right, so we're out. There's a little bit of grease on here still from the last person that did these brakes, so that's a good thing. But we can see that these are super ratty. They've been contaminated. There's chunks of things. They're starting to flake off. We've got rust all over here. It's kind of broken on this, this edge. So yeah, these definitely need to be replaced. But we can also see on this backside, this is that squeal. This is that low brake pad indicator. As you can see, we're kind of almost to where this thing would start coming into play. So had we driven this for a little bit longer, we probably would have had that gentle squeak, squeak, squeak telling us it was time to replace our brakes. So let's take a closer look at this rotor. We can tell it's a vented rotor, and again, there's really no nasty lip here or anything like that. It doesn't look like these have been cut before. So to get this surface rust off of here, we could just bring it over to the brake lathe and cut these, give it a clean surface, measure it, make sure we're not past our minimum thickness. But I don't see why we couldn't reuse these rotors if we were on a budget and had a brake lathe on hand. Another thing you'll notice on here, and I was kind of dreading them as I noticed it, but we've got these hold down screws that actually hold the rotor onto the hub. Now, that's not coming off because these screws hold it in place. Some cars have them, some don't. This one happens to be Phillips head. BMW uses Torx or Allen keys. Different manufacturers use different sizes, but these have these hold down screws. Now, a majority of the time when you get a car that has these on there, they have not been removed in a very, very long time. And luckily, I want to thank the tech that worked on this before, because he or she did a wonderful job of putting some anti-seize or some brake grease back in here so that these actually do come out. Now, I have an impact hammer here that I went and grabbed as soon as I saw those screws. And with an impact hammer, you put this in there and twist it the direction you're going to go, and it's kind of spring loaded, and then you hit it with a giant hammer. I've got a 5-pound sledge over there that I was getting ready to smash this end with to break them free, but luckily the tech that did this before me is awesome. So these just come out super easy with a screwdriver. Once again, huge shout out to whoever worked on these brakes before me. Thank you, you're my hero. Slide this off of here. And then we can see back inside to our wheel bearing. There's our rotor, backside, shake out all the rust. And yeah, this is in really, really good shape. It looks like they may have even put a little bit of grease back here to make sure it doesn't stick on the hub, because that's another common thing that happens. They most definitely did. You can feel a little bit of grease back here so that it doesn't rust in place. Another reason why I had a giant hammer is because sometimes they'll kind of rust themselves on here and chemically weld, essentially. So you have to bash this thing with a hammer for them to break free. It's a good thing when there's a little bit of grease back here, but too much grease, you think about it, this thing's spinning with your wheels. And if you start slathering grease all over the backside of this rotor, and you're going to see we're going to grease the backsides of the pads and these slides when it goes back together. If you start slathering grease everywhere and this starts spinning, you definitely don't want grease to be on the rotor surface or the surface of your pads. You got to be careful with it, but we'll do that when we go back to reassemble. All right, so as I'm cutting this together, the disassembly and the assembly videos kind of came together into a half-hour long ed puzzle, which is entirely too long. So I'm going to cut this one off here and then come back for the next installment, which will be after a trip to Napa for some new pads, and stop over at the brake lathe to cut those rotors and just do a real quick rough cut and a finish cut, and then reassemble. Be good, and I will see you next time.